We will Management International, Canterbury West, Thanet Parkway. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's talk as part of the GH26. Tonight we've got Lesley, who's absolutely fabulous. Everything she does. She is NDB as well as being a master beekeeper. She's vice chair of Cheshire Beekeepers Association as well as a founder member of Mid Cheshire Beekeepers. She's an assessor for the basic and gets involved with lots of training, and she has 3 apiaries with more colonies than she admits to. So over to you, Lesley. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm not quite sure how I live up to that, so that's no pressure, is it really? So hello everyone, it's lovely to be here tonight. This evening, it's quite timely this time of year. We're going to talk about feeding, we're going to talk about winter preparation, we're going to talk about uniting colonies, we'll talk a little bit about colony health. So without further ado, let's crack on. Diane, are we using the chat function for any queries that come in?
Do you want to be interrupted during the session or at the end?
Let's leave it till the end,
Okay.
and then, because obviously if I see anything flash up, I can try and answer the question as I go along, and then we can have a little bit of dialogue following the presentation, if that's okay.
Yeah, thanks.
So what will we actually look at? Well, throughout this evening, we'll look at all of those factors that are important for us as we come up in the run up to winter. So we're going to look at colony strength, and we'll look at colony configuration as well. Obviously we know that our bees they're not warm-blooded creatures, but they do need to maintain warmth, and they have to keep a critical mass over the winter. So we need to make sure that we've got good queens, we need to make sure that we've got plenty of bees. We're going to look a little bit at colony health. We hear a lot about this in many respects, so we just want to know that there's nothing unpleasant lurking in the colony that's going to actually cause us problems over the winter. So how we do pre-winter disease checks and so on. Nutrition is all important, so our bees do need to fill the pantry before winter and make sure that they have enough stores to keep them going through till spring. We'll look a little bit about location and what we perhaps need to think about in terms of apiary sites and how we manage the location of our bees in preparation for winter and during the winter months, and what we have to do to make sure that they are adequately protected and that they're going to be safe. And all of this we have to fit in with our beekeeping and with our beekeeping year. And sometimes, you know, the more colonies we have, the more difficult that gets. And it's really dependent on where we are in the country, what forage we've got, and so on. It's worth saying in all of this, it's really worth keeping things simple, if at all possible. Don't overthink it, don't overcomplicate it, and everything will be fine. So first of all, let's have a look at colony strength. And running the risk of cracking a joke at the expense of the BBKA, I can say with certainty that size really is important. Weaker colonies don't really do very well over winter generally. There are exceptions. But, you know, for most people's level of capability, a large colony will survive the winter much better than a small one. We need to make sure that they've got plenty of stores, they've got plenty of honey in the frames next to where the bees will cluster. Those bees need to be able to generate heat, which will allow that cluster to move about. So as they start to consume stores in the colony, they'll be able to move about to access a little bit more somewhere else. If the colony is small, it won't be able to generate sufficient heat to allow it to move around a little bit, whereas a stronger, warmer colony will actually be able to change location and change size more easily. And that's actually brought home to us very, very nicely by these thermal images of beehives in the winter. So these are taken using an infrared camera. And we can see the temperature gradient there is something like minus 1.5 centigrade through to about 5 centigrade, a little bit warmer in the middle. And we can see very clearly where the cluster is in the middle of that hive in the winter. So it's much, much warmer, and it's also really localized. The idea that the bees keep the entire colony warm is actually a fallacy. The bees keep their cluster warm, and they do move about within the cluster. So the key thing is to keep them safe and to keep them dry. And the bees will look after themselves in terms of heat. In terms of keeping the colony large enough and strong enough to survive the winter, what do we do if we've got, if we've got, say, half a dozen small colonies? Because really, 3 big ones would survive the winter much better than 6 small ones. And so we might consider uniting those colonies so that actually we've got fewer but larger colonies that will stand us in better stead over the winter months. But we don't just jump into that without really thinking about it. There are some quite important considerations. First and foremost, those colonies have to be healthy. If a colony is small, then why is that? Is it a weak colony? Is it diseased? So before you even consider uniting colonies, do a disease check and make sure that you've got good healthy colonies, and that you've got good quality queens. The location of the colonies is quite important, the flying range. So ideally, if you want to unite 2 colonies, make sure that they're close together. Move them beforehand if necessary, because if you don't, as soon as you actually try to unite the colonies, any flyers, they'll go home to where they think they should be. And if their putative home is 6 feet away, then there will be chaos and there'll be a lot of random bees floating about in the apiary. They won't know where they live. So do make sure that the colonies are close together. The image that we've got here on the second left are a couple that I've actually put together ready for uniting a little bit later in the year. I'll unite the nucleus colonies with the full-size colonies, and the nukes are just sitting on the top of those full-size colonies waiting for that uniting to happen. Time of day is important. So where we're uniting, we want to make sure that we do that in the evening. All the bees will be at home, so we know that we've got everybody in the colony ready for that manipulation. And also it minimises any sort of chaos that we might have with flying bees all over the place. And of course, there's the queen status. There genuinely only can be one. So if you are uniting 2 colonies, you need to make sure that you locate and remove the queen from one of them if you think they are both queen right. Choose the better of the 2 queens. Keep the good queen. Other queens, well, I usually find that I can offer them up to my association. There's always somebody who's wanting a queen. If the queens aren't particularly good quality, then they find themselves in the freezer for dissection at a later date. And sometimes you have to be cruel to be kind. It may be difficult dispatching a queen, but actually if you leave yourself with a strong colony over the winter, it will survive rather better. There are a number of different ways of going about the uniting process. I would recommend the newspaper method. It's pretty fail-safe. It's never failed me, to be honest. And in doing this, we're uniting a queen right colony with a queenless colony over a piece of newspaper. In this diagram, the queen right colony is on the bottom and the queenless colony is on the top. It really doesn't matter which way round they are because they will end up as one colony. If you can do it, whichever way, so that you know where the queen is, that helps, but it really doesn't matter whether she's on the top or whether she's on the bottom. With a national colony, which most of us run, you'll need to use broadsheet because tabloid is too small and it does all need to be one sheet of paper. I find that the Financial Times is a good quality uniting tool. It has to be one sheet of paper. That newspaper then serves to separate the 2 colonies while the pheromones from each of those colonies mingle. Each colony has its own very specific colony scent, and you can't just put them together without giving them a little bit of time to actually to mingle, because that will cause quite a lot of fighting. It will cause unrest. The bees will be defensive, and that's really not going to end well. What happens with this method is you separate the 2 colonies temporarily, but the bees can eventually chew through the newspaper. Newspaper is also slightly semi-porous, so all of the colony odors and the pheromones will mingle, and by the time the bees have chewed through that newspaper, there'll be no fighting because they're used to each other. They are as one. So if we look at this in terms of say 4 stages, here's one that I prepared earlier. The queen right colony is on the bottom as it was in the diagram. And it's got a newspaper barrier. I've secured the newspaper barrier with a queen excluder. The queen excluder isn't absolutely necessary, but it helps because it stops the newspaper blowing around. It holds everything in place. The second queenless colony is then put onto the top of that, on top of the newspaper. If one of them's a nucleus, then it helps to transfer it to a regular brood box so that you've got a matching footprint. So your queen right colony on the bottom, slice of newspaper, queen excluder, queenless colony on the top. All of my bees are in out apiaries, as Diane alluded to. So my next visit to this setup would be in a week's time, at which point I can then remove that top brood box, which would be containing the queenless colony. The queen is secure downstairs because there's a queen excluder on the top, so I know where she is. After a week, that newspaper appears completely chewed through. So what you can see there in the right-hand image is the brood box that was on the bottom, and there's no newspaper left on the top. You see the bees have eaten away all of that. So after a few days, doesn't necessarily take a week, may take sort of 2 or 3 days, the bees will have chewed through the newspaper, the colony odours mingle, there won't be any fighting, the bees will be free to fly. And at that point, you can then consolidate everything down into one brood box to make sure that everything is in one box for the winter period. In doing that, we do need to make sure that you maintain a natural brood nest shape, because you'll be taking frames of brood out of the top box and out of the bottom box. So don't be tempted just to pile it all in, because if that's the case, you will find that it could be quite a random setup, and the bees won't thank you for that. Bees are very particular about the shape of their brood nest and how that all comes together in the brood nest. Try to make sure that you respect the natural nest shape, which is something of the order, it's a sphere or a rugby ball shape, with a pollen barrier around the outside and the stores to the outside of that again. So just think a little bit about the brood nest shape when you reconsolidate the frames into a single box. And that's it. It's as easy as pie. As I say, there are other methods. Spraying with water is a method which can stop the bees fighting, confuses them a little bit. But I find that this method it's tidy, you don't get any fighting, and it is fairly fail-safe. So what about in terms of configuring for winter? Potentially, we're down at the apiary, we're looking at some of our colonies at the moment, they might be quite big. If you're having a good summer wherever you're located, there might be 4 or 5 supers on the colony. And it's difficult to see how it's going to be possible to compress all those bees down into a single brood box. This is one of my colonies in the apiary this is from a few years ago, to be fair. And we did have a very, very good year. This particular colony, at its peak, I think it had 6 or 7 supers on. It was doing really very well. But of course, the colony inside there was enormous. They are quite prolific bees. So it was impractical to try to squeeze all that into a single brood box for the winter. But generally, we wouldn't want to leave supers on the colony over winter. We certainly don't want to leave a queen excluder, because the queen can become isolated. So no queen excluder. And the trick is to take one of those supers and you put it underneath the brood box. You don't need to worry about there being any brood in the super, because we're going into a period where the brood will be diminishing. It means that the bees have additional space, so the bees have got somewhere to go. We're able to carry more sufficient reserves for a big colony over winter. And if you look at actually what happens during the winter period, these diagrams quite nicely show what the cluster of bees is doing from early through mid into late winter. So although they may occupy the bottom part of that brood box and super beneath, during the early winter, the cluster, which is shown here in the kind of grey-blue, you can see during midwinter it's gradually moving up to the late winter, and you'll find the cluster nearer the top. They will have consumed all of the stores in the super that you left underneath the brood box, and you can just slip that super out, and it's ready for storage during the spring until you actually need it for the next season. The super will be clean, it should be without brood, and it's really easy to remove. In the eventuality that there is any brood in the super, That's also quite easy to remedy. We just pop it back on top of the brood box over a queen excluder, making sure that the queen is in the brood box and not in the super, and just allow that brood to emerge. What's really key for the winter is making sure that the colony is healthy. Now, it's key all the time, but particularly so in winter, because the colonies can be quite vulnerable over the winter period. And more to the point, they're actually confined within their hive. They don't have the opportunity to fly freely as they would do during the spring and summer months. And of course, our nemesis is always going to be Varroa, one of the commonest pests, probably the pest which is at the moment the most threatening to our colony health. Varroa is endemic in the UK. If anybody ever says to me, my bees don't have Varroa, well, I would take that with a pinch of salt. We know that Varroa reproduce in the brood cells, they feed on the larvae, they will also feed on the adult bees. And they feed from the bees' fat bodies, which are a glycogen and nutrient store. So this is really important for the bees that we're developing over winter, because those bees, they need to be healthy, they need to have healthy fat bodies, and they need to have as much nutrient as possible. Second to that, Varroa, of course, carry many viruses, and the viruses can cause us a problem. When the Varroa pierces the larval skin, the integument, which becomes the bee's exoskeleton, that provides really easy ingress for virus, and the Varroa mites themselves act as a viral reservoir. So it's not surprising to see that if we don't control Varroa, either via husbandry methods or with chemical pesticides, uncontrolled Varroa will gradually destroy the colony unless you're lucky enough to have bees which exhibit some form of hygienic behaviour, and therein is a completely separate lecture. So the important thing for us really is to monitor the Varroa and the Varroa count before the winter. Let's get prepared and make sure that the colony is as healthy as possible going into that winter period. The easiest way to do this is via natural mite drop. There's lots of ways of monitoring Varroa, as we know. The commonest ones really, I suppose, for hobbyist beekeepers tend to be the natural mite drop that we've got illustrated here, or looking at the Varroa count in your drone pupae by drone uncapping, using an uncapping fork. Now, that's not really very sensible at this time of year. It's not very suitable because the amount of drone brood in our colonies is diminishing ahead of the winter. So ideally, we want to use a process which is going to give us reliable results, whatever the brood situation of the colony. I tend to use a natural mite drop method because it's simple, it's quite straightforward. I use a mesh floor underneath with a sampling board, which is just a whiteboard that slides in under the open mesh floor. And I leave those boards in place for a week. And again, that fits in with my beekeeping schedule because all of my colonies are in out apiaries and I do a once weekly visit. Where you're counting Varroa mites, it does help actually just to draw a mesh of some sort, a grid pattern on the boards with, say, a black felt tip marker pen. And it makes counting the Varroa mites so much easier because you can do one square at a time and don't lose count. We can rub a little bit of oil or a bit of Vaseline or something of that sort onto the board, which means that mites, they will stick onto the board, and they don't sort of blow away, and they're not quite as readily consumed by scavenging insects such as ants and so on. After a week, withdraw the sampling board. There'll be a lot of debris on that sampling board, and you can see the image here shows quite clearly where the seams of bees are, because there's debris from uncapping, there's bits of bees, there's going to be bits of wax, there might be eggs, there might be other little insects, there might be pollen that's been dropped through, but there will also be Varroa mites. And in counting those Varroa mites, depending on what time of year it is, that correlates with how many mites there are in the colony. We always want to aim for there being fewer than 1,000 mites in the colony. So at this time of year, through May through August, and we're going into, it'll be September before we know it really, the multiplication factor is we say times 30 for May through August, rising to times 100 for September, October time. So if you do a mite count in August, and let's say you have 20 mites fall out of your colony, you can multiply that by 30, which means the grand total is that's indicating that you've got 600 mites in the colony. We know we want to keep less than 1,000. So you might think, well, that's actually not too bad a figure. But if you take a look, the figures that are given by the National Bee Unit, it's actually really quite useful, because the amount of action that you need to take varies depending on the time of year. And if we look at the graph that we have on screen, for the time of year where we are now, August through September, if your daily mite drop is, say, 4 mites, well, do you need to take any action? Possibly not. But if your daily mite drop is a little bit higher than that, you might need to take some kind of control against Varroa. When I started beekeeping, I was taught that Varroa control is something that we do according to the time of year, without necessarily monitoring. It was just something that everybody did. But it's actually much better practice to monitor and to do the Varroa control as and when it's needed, rather than just by rote. So do take a look at the information which is published by the National Bee Unit. They provide good guidance on a regimen that will keep your numbers less than 1,000 mites, and whether you need to exert any kind of light control, which might be a husbandry method or a type of varroicide or drone brood removal, versus an effective control which you would need to do straight away. If you were getting more than, at this time of year, more than 6 to 8 mites daily, then you really do need to think about doing a Varroa control. And effective control, that would mean a varroicide which has got a high efficacy. So, for example, Formic Pro, formic acid strips, they're about 95% effective. Some of the thymol treatments, about 85% effective. Even if your colony falls into the no action required yet category in August, it's worth monitoring, because those mite numbers will go up very quickly. It's worth mentioning that drone brood removal as a control strategy has an efficacy of about 50%. But that would only be at the peak of the year, when we've got a lot of drone brood. There's not very much drone brood about at the moment, so it's really not very suitable for this time of year. But just for completeness, if you use drone brood uncapping as a tool to check your mite levels, then there are some figures, again given by the National Bee Unit, that indicate what the mite count is likely to be and what level of control you need to take, depending upon the proportion of infested brood that you see when you're carrying out drone and capping. So in terms of Varroa treatments that are suitable for winter preparation, at this time of year, really, we're down to chemical pesticides, and they fall into a number of different categories. Essential oils, so these are our thymol products like Apiguard, Apilifer, Thymovar, and so on. The organic acids, so formic acid products, and the only one which we've actually got approved in the UK at the moment is Formic Pro. And then there's the synthetic pesticides, amitraz and taufluvalinate. So Apivar, Apitraz, and Apistan. It's confusing, I know, because often, the names, they all sound very similar. Each have their advocates, each have their criticisers. Depending upon the timing of your beekeeping operation, where you live, how you manage your colonies, it's a very personal thing which of these products you might find works best. I tend to lean towards the organic acids, because they have a 1-week exposure period. Again, it fits with my beekeeping schedule. They're not too sensitive in terms of daytime temperatures. I'm based in Cheshire, and sometimes it's a little bit chilly up here in September. And there is no obvious resistance to these organic acids. Resistance is now localized for amitraz and really quite widespread for taufluvalinate. So although these synthetic pesticides are appropriate to use once in a while, I certainly wouldn't be using them on a regular basis, because therein lies a problem with resistance issues. They also have a very long exposure period, 6 to 8 weeks, needing quite high temperatures. So that would require me to start my Varroa treatments at a time that for me is actually earlier than I would want to do. And essential oils, thymol products, I generally dislike them. I don't like the smell of them, and the fact that they do need quite warm temperatures to achieve optimum efficacy. The mode of action of thymol products isn't really very well understood either. Whether it's through inhalation or volatilization is not entirely clear. For more information about Varroa treatments, there's a really useful quick guide in Kirsty Stainton's book, Varroa Management, which I cannot rate too highly. It really is very good. It's very readable, it's quite succinct, and it's extremely complete, and it's up to date. But as I say, it's very much up to the individual which treatment you choose to if you're going down a Varroa treatment route ahead of the winter. But let's say a little bit about winter bees and why it really is so important to get things right in the autumn. Bear with me on this one because it looks complicated, but it looks more complicated than it really is. We hear quite a lot about summer bees and about winter bees, but what does that actually mean? If we look at the graph and look carefully at the graph, the age of the bees is indicated on the vertical axis. Eggs and brood, the youngest, are at the bottom. They're coloured black, and this one of dark yellowish colour in the band at the bottom, which is shaded in grey. On top of that, we've got the adult bees, which can be aged anywhere between 1 and 100 days old. So in these population graphs, the number of bees is indicated by the width of those spinning top shaped coloured bars at each of the 9 intervals, and those 9 intervals they're at 12-day periods. So if we look at the end of August, which is the first column that we have there with the fat blue spinning top, all of the adult bees present in the hive at the end of August are coloured blue, and we can see how the number of those blue coloured bees diminishes as we go through September, October, November, and so on. It gradually gets fewer and fewer. There's a lot of those bees left at the August, but almost all of them have disappeared by mid-November. However, look at the remaining colours. Look at those bees which are emerging at the beginning to middle of October and thereafter. So for example, look at those which are coloured yellow and look at those which are coloured green. And we can see that there's a reasonably consistent number of those bees, of those subpopulations, going through the year. So the population distribution is consistent, but aging through the winter. Although 2/3 of our August bees have died by October, our September and October bees are simply there in the colony, just going old gracefully. So that means that some of these bees, as they go through the winter, they're going to be 70, 80 days old, much older than a summer bee would be. They have to have longevity, and they have to survive many months cooped up in the colony over winter. So it's really important that they're in tip-top health. But it does beg the question why we suddenly have all these long-lasting bees in the colony. Well, let's think about where our bees come from. Why do we get summer bees and why do we get winter bees? When we look at the evolutionary and migratory background of bees, whichever model we choose to look at, and there are new developments, there are new postulates coming out all the time, it's fairly clear that honeybees originated in either Africa or in Southeast Asia. In some respects, that location is actually irrelevant. The key thing is that those locations are not seasonal in the way that our temperate lands are seasonal. So there's no major variation in forage availability throughout the year. In order to survive the dearth that we have over winter, in our more northern habitats, the bees have evolved a strategy to cope with that absence of forage. They gather a surplus of stores, so they fill up the pantry for winter, but they've also evolved physiologically to store and use bodily resources during a time when there's no pollen and there's no nectar for them to forage. So if we look at the tropical bees in Asia and the tropical bees in Africa, they have very little in terms of forage variability during the year. But our temperate bees that we see in the green stripe there in Europe and Northern Europe can be marked difference in forage availability throughout the year. And it's in the temperate bees that we see the strategy of the winter bee developing. And it's all about this thing called the fat body, which is what we referred to earlier on when talking about Varroa. Fat body is essentially, it doesn't mean that we have portly bees, slightly overweight bees. It does just mean that those bees have a well-developed organ inside their body cavity, which is used as storage cells, both in developing larvae and in adult bees. So when you look at a larva, it's white. And the white that we can see through the larval skin is the fat body. In the adult bee, however, we don't see that as such. The fat body occupies the space along the top of the bee's back and underneath the bee's belly. So it's actually a deposit of pale coloured cells, which is actually in the dorsal and ventral sinus. Those fat bodies look like a thin layer of white cells against the outside of the bee. They contain oonocytes, which are cells that contain oils. And oils, of course, are very rich in calories. So we can see that the fat body it's basically a physiological store within the bee. So it's important that the bee has a well-developed fat body. The fat body also has a secret weapon. It produces an enzyme known as vitellogenin, which is a protein. It's key to winter survival, and it's key to the spring colony buildup. Vitellogenin is linked with longevity, so we find a lot of vitellogenin in our queen bees and not very much at all in the drones. And we know from various bits of scientific research that bees with high levels of vitellogenin are much better able to store protein reserves, which means that they will have the strength and they'll have the capability in the spring to feed the brood when there's really not very much pollen around. In order to have those good vitellogenin stores, they need good protein intake in youth. So we can see, just joining the dots here, that what's really important is really good nutrition and really good pollen intake in the late summer and the early autumn when those winter bees are developing. So if you just cast your mind back to the graph with the spinning tops, all the winter bees, they're developing around sort of September time, August, September. So nutrition in the autumn and from now onwards, really, super important to develop good winter bees. And just so we can see what it actually looks like, here's quite a nice dissection showing the difference between a summer bee and a winter bee. In the summer bee, the fat body, which is the layer of white cells that you can see against the segments there, it's quite dispersed, it's poorly developed. There's not very much vitellogenin in that bee and she's quite short-lived. In the winter bee, she's got ample fat body, so there's lots of white tissue there against the outside of the bee's exoskeleton. She's able to develop nutrition from these internal sources, and she's able to develop plenty of vitellogenin, so that bee is long-lived. She's going to survive until the spring, and in the spring she will have the capability to nurture young, which is exactly what we want to maintain the health of the colony over winter and ensure that that colony can subsequently kickstart in spring. So what do we need to do? Well, we need to make sure that our bees are healthy, and we need to make sure that our bees are well nourished. So we need to address Varroa issues and we need to address issues of nutrition. This can be a dilemma because which comes first? And it depends very much on the location and the season. And that's something that only an individual can know, depending on your own bees, your own apiary sites and your own forage. None of the Varroa treatments that we have indicated in the UK can be used with supers on. All need to be done once the supers are taken off the colonies. So that means after the honey harvest. And that could get quite late into the year, depending on when you take your honey harvest. So from my perspective, many of my bees have been foraging on the Himalayan balsam. My colonies get really big at this time of year. And the balsam will be in flower until the first frost, through to sort of September, October. So I try not to do my honey harvest until late September, which means that I have to do my Varroa treatments in September. But is it too late? Because by that time, the temperatures are dropping and some of the Varroa treatments are less efficacious at low temperature. So we can see the benefit here of really good husbandry throughout the year, keeping the Varroa levels in check so that I have the latitude to be able to make sure that I can continue my beekeeping through August and September in a way which doesn't only benefit me, but it means that my colonies are as healthy as possible going into the winter. If I take my honey harvest off at September, the ivy will come into flower in October. Anything that the bees get from the ivy is for them. Although, to be fair, there's an argument in favour of doing your winter feed before the ivy start to let nectar in any seriousness, because ivy honey will granulate very solidly and the bees sometimes find it very difficult to mobilize those granulated reserves. So you don't really want to have a brood box which is completely full of ivy honey, because the bees may find it very difficult to use that over the winter. So if you do a feed beforehand, then it does minimize the amount of solid stores that you will have in your colony over the winter. So let's have a look at what the nutritional requirements are then of the honeybee colony. It's more than we might think, and the period during which that is required might differ from what we're expecting. So if we look at what weight of stores we're needing for overwintering from November through the winter months, December, January, February, and then into the spring, the bees don't use a great deal of stores through November, December, January. It's cold, the bees are in cluster, they're not really flying, they're not mobile, they keep warm, and that requires quite a lot of energy, but they're not active. As they start to get active and start brood rearing again in February, March time, when the brood rearing really does kick off, the bees are required to do two things. They're required to feed that brood, and they're required to generate heat to look after the brood and to keep the conditions in the hive suitable. And this is where the reserves will really start to drop very quickly. So while your bees may only have been consuming about £2 a month during December and January, you might see that start to go up quite steeply through the early spring months, through to sort of £8 a month in March, £16 a month in April. This is the point at which we've got a peak starvation risk. It can catch us on the hop because the colonies are needing a lot of nutrition, but there's nothing out there for them. There's no natural forage. So we really do need to keep an eye on the colonies, particularly in spring, to make sure that they have sufficient stores to keep them going. This is a very rough guide. It depends on the strain of bee, it depends on the size of the colony. And the data given here are for national. So if you're running Langstroths, if you're running 1412s, for example, or they're bigger colonies, they might need proportionately more. So I run 1412s. They're big colonies generally, and it'd be 1412 with a super underneath as well. So I try to leave my colonies with a little bit more stores over the winter. Just a few feeding essentials for the winter then. It's key to provide the stores before the winter, and there's a number of different ways to do this. Again, everybody has their preferred method. What's important is we should be doing it all in one go, so get all of the feed in one time and aim to complete within a week. Feed early enough so that the bees are able to convert that syrup into stores by September, October. And of course, it depends on your location and it depends on your temperatures. Preferably feed in the evening, because if you're feeding during the daytime, that may alert some of the flying bees to the fact that there's food nearby, and they can't differentiate that from normal floral forage, and so it can set off robbing. The thick syrup that you want to use for a winter feed is about 1 kilogram of white granulated sugar to about 625 millilitres of water. Again, you know, the quantities are not absolutely carved in tablets of stone. Don't overthink it. If you use 1 kilogram of sugar to 600 millilitres of water or 575 millilitres of water. It really doesn't matter. It will absolutely do the job. Alternatively, you could choose to use a pre-prepared bee feed. This is what I do. I've got too many colonies to think about mixing sugar syrup. It's a little bit more of an expensive option, but it's actually quite convenient for me. There's plenty of different pre-prepared bee feeds available on the market. So the three that we've got, a couple we've got here, Ambrosia and Apimix. There are others, and they're usually balanced in sugar type, so they would contain fructose, glucose, and sucrose. They're what's known as inverted sugar syrups, and they resist granulation. So unlike a sugar syrup that you might make at home in your kitchen, a pre-prepared bee feed will keep. So I make a bulk purchase once a year. If I don't use it all, it's fine. It just sort of sits around and it doesn't mold and it doesn't go off. So it's quite convenient in that respect. Some of these products you can buy in bulk. So if you want to organise that as an association, the price comes down fantastically if you can organise a bulk buy. And that works really very well. So Apimix or Ambrosia is something of the order between 45 and 47 pounds for a 12.5 kilogram jerry can, which is one of the ones pictured here, the normal size jerry can, which is about £3.60 a kilogram. You can get that down to about £1.50 a kilogram by buying in bulk if you provide your own containers, if you buy an IPC, an intermediate bulk container. And that's really good for association purchases. Different sorts of feeders. There are as many different sorts of feeders as there are different sorts of beekeeper. And some of the ones that we've got illustrated here are just the typical feeders that you might find. The majority, and the ones that we tend to prefer for feeding at this time of year, are top feeders. So ones where, for example, the footprint matches the brood box size. And the ones that we have illustrated are the Miller feeder, where there is a reservoir underneath and a central access point for the bees to come up through the middle of the feeder and then to access the feed reservoir from the centre. An Ashforth feeder is exactly the same principle, but the access point is at the end rather than in the middle, which is quite handy if your colony isn't on particularly level ground. Frame feeders seem to have gone out of fashion a little bit of late. They have their uses because they're quite safe, and again they will discourage rubbing, but you do need to go into the colony to access the feeder, and there are reports of bees drowning in the frame feeder if you don't sort of pack them with straw or put some kind of float in there. They're not my choice, they're not my feeder of choice, but they do have their advocates. Ideally, I tend to use what's called a rapid feeder, and particularly at this time of year, I rather like the big green feeders. They are literally called the big green feeders. They sit on top of the crown board or directly onto the frames, and each one of those feeders will hold sort of 3 gallons of feed. So I can put the entire winter feed on in one go. It's great for an out apiary because I can just pop the feed on and leave it there, and the bees will take all of that feed down in the week. And when I go back the following week to the out apiary, I can take the feeders off, clean them, and they go away for another year. Or alternatively, we could use a contact feeder, which is an inverted bucket with a small mesh in it. Commercially, they're available to hold about a gallon or more. And they are quite convenient. They do need to have an empty super or an eek around them, just to provide a little bit of space for that contact feeder to sit on top of the crown board. On the downside, the mesh that the bees will use to take the feed from the underside of that bucket is very fine. It needs to be to hold the feed inside, and the bees will propolize it. So sometimes you might find that the bees aren't taking the feed from the feeder, and when you take it off, they've completely propolized the mesh. So they've closed the door to their own pantry. Again, often we can find there are so many different options. We don't always have the right piece of kit available at the right time. And again, it's worth saying, don't overthink it. This is one of my improvisations from last year when I ran out of big green feeders, and I did want to make sure that all of the colonies in a particular apiary were fed at the same time. Again, which cuts down on any chaos, it cuts down on any possibility of robbing. So 4 contact feeders directly onto the frame bars inside an eek, and it's not optimal because the contact feeders rather than rapid feeders, but it's better than putting the feed on 2 weeks later when I got back from my holidays and the bees took that feed as easily as they would with any other kind of feeder, and it absolutely worked a treat. Just a few additional feeding essentials. It's not only the winter time that we need to feed. Obviously, for a winter feed, we need to feed a thick syrup, and that colony might go through 40 pounds of thick syrup. And the figures I gave were a kilogram of sugar to about 625 millilitres of water. But there are other sorts of feed for other kinds of purpose. So building up a colony in the spring, for example, if you want to make sure that your colony is as strong as possible in preparation for foraging on the oilseed rape, a thin syrup will stimulate brood rearing. It will stimulate the queen to lay. And there you'll be looking at something like a kilogram of sugar to a litre, 1.2 litres of water. Comb building will also require quite a lot of feed. So comb building is expensive for bees. To build a kilogram of wax, the bees need to consume probably between 6 and 8 kilograms of stores or of honey or of nectar. So if you have a colony that needs to be building comb, for example, if you are doing a manipulation like a Bailey comb change or a shook swarm, or if you're hiving a swarm and then going to need the resources to build some comb, don't skimp on the feed. Make sure the bees have the resources that they need. If we've made a split, sometimes the balance of bees may be disrupted. It may not be the correct balance of young bees and old bees in the colony at any one time. And if there are relatively few foragers, then a feed will help that small colony get established. And as we know, in the UK, our weather can be a little bit unpredictable. There could be periods of dearth in the middle of the summer if it's very dry, so the plants aren't letting any nectar, or if it's very wet, or the so-called June gap. So we do need to keep an eye on the weather. We need to keep an eye on the amount of stores in the colonies. And if poor weather or very hot weather and dry weather is preventing foraging and there's nothing out there for the bees, then sometimes we just need a feed to boost reserves. And for any of those things, an intermediate strength syrup. So I use about a kilogram of sugar to a litre of water. And that can actually just help your bees along at those times when a little bit of extra feed can be quite useful for them. So those are some of the essentials for the winter preparation. But some things that sometimes we might really overlook are some of the simple considerations. So what about the location of your colonies? It may be obvious to think, but actually firm ground is really important. A good summer location might not be quite so good in the winter, particularly in ground that might get waterlogged, because a beehive in the winter is a very, very heavy piece of equipment, and they can and do fall over on soft ground. Particularly if the conditions get a little bit windy. So do make sure that where your colonies are, they're firmly sited. If at all possible, stand your hives onto a flagstone or similar so that they've got a firm footing. If you've got water courses near your colonies, do keep an eye on them. River levels can rise very quickly, as we know, and that's really not going to end very well. And similarly, if you need access, we need level access pretty much all the way through the year, but at least on foot during the winter, you are going to need to get round the apiary to be able to heft your hives, to be able to check on stores, just to be able to walk past and make sure that everything's okay. And you don't really want to have to wade through a foot of water to do that. And it certainly wouldn't do the bees any good. So do make sure that you've got the access and that you've got dry access. And similarly, if your site is a little bit windy, if your apiary isn't particularly well sheltered, might you need to think about a windbreak or some method of sheltering the colonies. A chill wind, particularly on exposed sites, can really make a difference because the bees will have to work quite hard to stay warm. Clearly don't move the bees when the cluster has formed in the dead of winter. And there's lots to think about. But if you do feel that a different overwintering site might be advantageous, then don't rule it out. It's also worth thinking about some protection for the colony itself. What do we need to do on an individual colony level? Protection against the elements, protection against the wind. Make sure that your roofs are weighted down. Strap your hives down, strap them to the ground, strap them to the hive stands. If necessary, just make sure that nothing can blow over. And a very nice innovation that one of my friends, Mark Phillipson, uses is to have these slightly pitched roofs. They just drop on top of a normal flat roof, but they do have a little bit of a slope on them, galvanized metal roofs, and they mean that the water will actually just not pool on the roof, which helps. Also, you can see the overhang is a little bit like a pagoda, and it takes the running water away from the sides of the hive, so it does help to keep the hive dry. So that's quite a nice touch, I think. Don't forget about mice. Quite fond of a warm nesting place. So although they're cute and lovely, they're really not quite so cute when you find them in your colonies. And it can be a bit of a surprise both to the beekeeper and to the mouse when we find out that we've got mice in there. So unfortunately, the centre image there is one of my colonies that did get a little bit of a mouse problem a couple of years ago, and you can see that they wreak havoc. They will eat their way through the combs. They'll make a terrible mess. The mice have built a whole nest in there. So they'll destroy the combs, they'll create a mess. And moreover, bees will avoid comb that's been contaminated with mouse urine. So the whole lot really needs to be destroyed. It's very easily prevented. Just make sure that you put your mouse guards on before it gets too cold. Mouse guards will knock pollen from the bees' legs, so don't put them on too early. But equally, if the nights are getting a little bit chilly, that's the point at which a mouse will be able to get in, and they will get in through the smallest of holes. So make sure that you have a good quality mouse guard to deny access to our furry friends. Let's keep them outside where they belong. In some areas, you may need to guard against woodpeckers. Woodpeckers can target hives in the winter. Now, it very much depends upon whether the woodpeckers have worked out what to do. It's a learned behavior. So once you've had a woodpecker attack, you probably need to make sure that you protect the colonies after that. The woodpeckers, like any creature over winter, they're just seeking food, they're seeking nourishment. So they'll consume bees, they'll consume larvae, and they do have quite a sweet tooth, so they'll consume any stores as well. They will go through a cedar hive quite easily, and they will go through a polyhive like a hot knife through butter. But to do so, they need to grip the side of the hive. So there's some quite easy remedies that we can use to make sure that the woodpeckers don't get access to the side of the hive. And just using a wrap of chicken wire or something similar means that the woodpecker can't get close enough to the hive to be able to actually get a grip. And it does maintain the ventilation around the boxes as well. So that's quite easily done, but something that we need to think about. And badgers, well, if you're unlucky enough to have had a badger problem, again, this is a learned behaviour. I've had apiaries that have been sitting right on top of badger sets, and I've never had any issues at all. But I think once the badgers learn that there's something sweet and lovely inside that box, then it can be a real problem. And badgers will turn to beehives if their other food sources are unavailable. So during prolonged cold spells, if the badgers start to get a little bit hungry, they'll seek out food from elsewhere, and they will eat honey, they'll eat wax, they'll eat pollen, they'll eat brood, they'll eat anything really, and they will make very short work of beehives. So robust fencing, electric fences, and so on, if you think you're likely to have problems with badgers. I should add that it's rare, it's really rare, but it's not completely out of the question. So when do we start thinking about winter? Well, I've heard it said that in beekeeping, there's only a few different seasons. There's the season where you're in the winter, there's the season where you're coming out of the winter, and there's the season where you're preparing for the winter. So ultimately, it should be something which is always there at the back of our minds. At this time of year, so July, August sort of time, there are preparations that we can do. So we can be monitoring and treating for varroa. We should be doing that all year, really. But at this time of year, making sure that we've got adequate pollen stores, making sure that we've got adequate stores, time to remove the main honey crop in some areas, or perhaps a little bit later if you choose to be taking your bees to the heather. It's August time when we're thinking about starting to make those initial preparations. Then in the autumn, things really start to hot up. So as we go into September, we start to make winter preparations in earnest, clearing the supers, removing the queen excluders, putting the super underneath the brood box if necessary, if you want to give a bit of extra stores, a little bit of extra space. Consolidating colonies, making sure that they're disease-free, uniting weak colonies, as we spoke about earlier, and again, always monitoring for varroa. During October and November, really, we should be allowing the bees undisturbed time. It's not uncommon to have late season supersedium mating during October, and quite frequently, we'll go into the colony in the spring and there's a new unmarked, unclipped queen in there that certainly wasn't there in the springtime and in the summer. So we know that mating does happen late in the year. Much after the end of August, I tend to leave my colonies for some quiet time. I use that time to tidy up the apiary, to make sure that the bees are adequately protected, and make sure that they've got mouse guards, make sure that the roofs are weighed and so on. And then during November, I'll heft the hives, keep the entrances clear, and leave the bees alone for the winter. As I say, the late season forage is quite important. So from my perspective, the Himalayan balsam is coming in, and that's coming in aplenty. And I can see even now my bees are out foraging on the balsam. I can see the telltale pollen signature on the back of the bee's thorax. And ivy, although many people dislike ivy, it's a really important late season nectar and pollen source for the overwintering colonies. And if you see your bees in August, September, October, November coming in with some of these telltale markers, so the white ghosting, or indeed the bright yellow pollen later in the year, you know that they're still actually bringing in some resources. So just a few last words about winter checks, really. Through December, January and February, there's relatively little that we can do. We should be hefting the hives to check for sufficient stores. During the peak winter months here, you won't really feel the weight of your colonies going down terribly. It's worth, if you have more than one colony, just to do a comparative check. It becomes very clear very quickly if one of them is getting a little bit light. We can consider doing an oxalic acid treatment during the broodless period in December, whether that's an oxalic acid trickle or a vaporization, again, very, very much up to the individual. But, on a slightly lighter note, start your planning for the forthcoming season. What are you going to do with your bees' forage? Do you intend to take your bees to the oilseed rape? What are your aspirations for the coming year? It's time when the end of season sales might be on, so it might be time to snap up a few bargains and do a little bit of beekeeping retail therapy. January, February, again, keep an eye on the stores and make sure that there is sufficient there. You can feed with fondant directly on top of the frame bars if necessary, and it's helpful just to make sure that you've got a source of water close to the colonies. It's also really worth making sure that you just have a look around the apiary, have a look around your equipment to make sure that everything is quite solid, and that you've not got any breakages, you've got anything that needs to be repaired. There's a couple of ways of non-invasive monitoring. So we can look at the imaging. So if you're lucky enough to have a thermal imaging camera, then that's really worth doing, actually, to have a look at the colonies during the winter, because it's fascinating when you can see the cluster and as it moves about week on week. Hefting is an important skill and something that we really all should be learning. It does take a little bit of practice. A heavy hive should be quite difficult to lift from the floor. Check both weights, because the weight distribution will often be unbalanced, and you'll be able to feel if there's more or less stores on one side than on the other. When I'm doing this, I take the roofs off because I use deep roofs, and the roofs are heavy. They're quite heavy in their own right. If you're not sure and you're not confident with hefting, use a luggage weight like a gauge or a spring balance. And you can measure each side of the colony and get an accurate measure of weight. Or again, you can put an inspection board under, and you'll be able to see from the debris that falls onto the inspection board that the colony is active. And you'll be able to see the uncapping and the debris that falls from the seams of bees where they're uncapping stores as they use it during the winter. So a few summary essentials for preparing for and getting through the winter successfully. Obviously, our colonies need to be queen right. Make sure you've got a laying queen. Make sure you can see eggs, young larvae. You don't need to see the queen to know that she's there, but you do need to see eggs. You need to make sure that the eggs that she's laying are worker eggs. So you need to make sure that you can see sealed worker brood. So she's not a drone layer. It's not a queenless colony. They're not laying workers, anything unpleasant like that. And if the colonies are too small or they're not too strong, then unite with another colony once you're sure that that colony is healthy and that it's disease-free. The health status we should be monitoring all the time. Winter bees are in cluster, so disease transmission is easier. So do make sure that you minimize any opportunities for disease transmission by making sure that the colonies are healthy ahead of time. If the colonies appear a little bit weak, or if you see any dysentery staining, ask your branch microscopist for an nosema test. That can be quite straightforwardly remedied by a change of queen if you feel that the bees are nosemic. And stores, of course, about 40 pounds of stores recommended as a minimum for a usual national colony. Keep an eye on the location, keep an eye on the weather. The bees may be tucked up for the winter, tucked up quietly, but actually they have to be dry. They can tolerate cold, but they will fail to tolerate damp. That will cause problems. Make sure that your hives are secured, make sure that your roofs are secured and that hives are off the ground and that they're clear of undergrowth underneath so that the colony is safe and it's dry. Make sure the colony is protected and it's well ventilated. A respiring colony during the winter can create quite a lot of carbon dioxide and quite a lot of water, and that, if it's left in a damp condition, can cause mold, which we don't want at all. So I keep my open mesh floors open all the time. That provides ventilation. If you're on solid floors, you may need to lift the crown board a little. And there is certainly a case for covering the feed holes during the winter to prevent a great draft of cool air going up the centre of the colony. And the mouse guards, of course, to prevent unwelcome visitors. And aside from that, leave them alone. Leave the bees alone. Disturbance can raise the colony temperature. And as they get warm and they move about more, they consume more stores. So wherever possible, leave them alone to actually get through the winter and have their quiet time. Obviously, guard against woodpeckers and so on, but leave the bees alone. There is no need at all to be going into the brood box really towards the end of the year, right through probably to about March time, other than perhaps just for an oxalic acid dribble at the coldest point of the winter when we've got that brood-free period. But you should be able to find everything that you know by hefting the hives. So there we'll finish. I'm happy to take any questions if anybody has any. And I think, Diane, the presentation will be available via the BBKA for consumption at your leisure afterwards, should you wish to.
Yes, that's right. We'll make it available. Thank you so much, Lesley. That was absolutely excellent. There are so many comments, and some of them you've answered because you've preempted those comments. So we won't go through all the questions.
Okay, shall I unshare my screen so that you can see me?
Yeah, that'd be great. I can do that there.
Oh,
so lovely. So the first thing is, when is the best time to remove the nadired super?
I remove mine in the spring when I'm doing the first inspections. As I say, I leave my bees alone over the winter. And so I'm unlikely really to go into the colonies unless we get a really warm snap, such as we did this year. And I did some quite early year inspections. I don't tend to go into the colonies until it's a good sort of 13, 14 degrees. As a rule of thumb, if I can go outside in my shirt sleeves and I'm comfortable, then it's okay for a quick look. and I'll remove it then. I'd never really have a situation where there's any brood in that nadir'd super. And if there is, as I say, it's quite easily remedied. But the queen will start laying at the top of the colony, and she will work her way down. So as the formative brood nest develops in the spring, she'll always start at the top, and then it will actually spread outwards. So I think at the time of the first inspection is probably reasonable. I certainly wouldn't be going in any earlier than that to take it off especially.
Thank you. And what do you do with the nadir'd super frames if you put a treatment on for varroa during winter?
I tend not to put the treatment on when there's any supers on the colony at all, and I'll just pop it back under later. As I said, my treatment of choice is Formic Pro, and because it's quite a short exposure period, it's only a week, I can usually get away with that. I have in the past used some of the chemical pesticides with a longer exposure period, and I've done that with a nadir'd super in place, but I just make sure that that super is one that I keep those frames for that purpose. They don't ever get put back into the honey processing cycle. Because as we know, we do have to guard against residues in the honey and in the wax.
Yeah, and you can do that by marking the frames quite easily, can't you?
Yes,
So
absolutely. Yeah.
Someone asks, if you don't think it matters which box goes on top or underneath when you're uniting, how do the drones get out of the top box?
Well, they're only going to be in there for a few days, so it's usually not a problem. At this time of year, there should be relatively few drones in the colony anyway. Sometimes we need to unite at different times of the year, and then it might be more of a consideration. But certainly as we're coming on to the winter, I mean, I don't know about you, but there's not really very many drones left in the majority of my colonies now. So it doesn't tend to be too much of a problem.
No, and Mark said he uses a roll of lining paper which slows them down enough, and more so than thin newspaper. So I thought that was quite a useful hint.
Yes, yeah, as I say, I quite favour the Financial Times. I don't think the bees can read though, so it may be wasted on them.
No, I think it's a way up of what costs more, Financial Times for a roll of lining paper. Let me see. What triggers the queen to lay winter bees, or are there physiological changes triggered in the adult bees rather than the eggs and larvae?
It's a physiological change about the feeding. So it's the eggs that the queen lays, to the best of my knowledge, and I may in the future be proven wrong on this one. To the best of my knowledge, they are all the same. But the feed that they receive dictates how well that fat body develops, and it's all about good nutrition.
Okay. Do you insulate over winter, dummying and top insulation to help with thermodynamics?
I do not. And I know that this is something which can really polarize opinion. So some people are advocates of insulation. There are those who advocate the use of fully insulated hives or polyhives because they have better thermal properties. I'm not one of them, to be honest. I've never found it to be a problem. I have done a partially controlled experiment with polyhives versus timber hives to see whether there was any noticeable difference in the colony strength and the build-up speed in the spring, and it didn't seem to make a great deal of difference. But again, it might be due to the strain of bee. I've probably inadvertently selected for quite prolific bees over the years. And so the majority of my bees actually build up quite quickly in the spring anyway, so I didn't notice any difference. If you read some of Derek Mitchell's work, he's done some quite interesting work on thermodynamics. And he's a very strong advocate of insulation and keeping the bee warm. And he argues that in its natural environment, a bee colony would occupy a cavity in a tree, which is much better insulated than the thin wooden boxes that we keep them in the apiary. But I'll be honest, I don't insulate. I've never found a need to insulate. I'm unlikely to start insulating now. Habitually, I tend not to lose colonies over the winter because I feed them very well, and I look after them. I make sure that they're dry and they're protected. It's damp that's the problem and not cold.
Thank you. Someone's asking, could you explain again how to do a daily mite count?
Yes. Assuming we're going to do that using a burrow inspection board, so you just need to put a little bit of oil or Vaseline onto the inspection board first. It means that the stuff that falls out of the colony sticks to the board. Pop the board under and leave it there for a good few days. I would recommend a week. At the end of the week, take it out, count the varroa mites on the board, and the total number of mites that you've got on that board divided by the number of days of exposure, that's your daily mite count. So if I left the board in for a week, so I left it in for 7 days, and I've got 77 mites on the board at the end of that time, I know that my daily mite drop is 11 mites a day. And from there, I can then look at the numbers which are provided by the National Bee Unit, and that will indicate to me, depending on the time of year, do I need to do a treatment urgently? Do I need to think about doing a treatment or some biotechnological manipulation, or is it actually okay for the time being? And it very much depends on both the time of year and what the mite count is.
Thank you. I think this will be the last question. How do you check against overfeeding and becoming honeybound before winter, please?
That's a very good question, actually. In my experience, if the bees don't need the feed, they won't take it. And sometimes you find that a colony is replete, it's still got a feeder on, and there's still feed there, and they're just not taking it down. I tend to feed quite late in the year, and my bees get 3 gallons of feed whether they want it or not. And it's very seldom that they haven't got the space for that. I should add that I'm running 1412s, they're quite big colonies, and so there is the space for that. Generally, I've not found there to be a problem with there being too much stores in the colony. If you're unsure, check the colony before you do your feed, because of course it may already be quite replete. We know that a brood frame, for example, a standard national brood size frame full of stores weighs about 5 pounds. So if you have every frame in your colony full, that would be over 50 pounds of stores, which is more than enough for the winter. That's unlikely to be the case, of course, because there's still quite a lot of brood in the colony. But by assessing how much stores there is on each frame as you go through one of your final inspections towards the end of the year, you can work out how much is already in there and therefore how much you need to provide for their winter feed.
Thank you. I think it's important to have an idea of how much honey is in the hive before you heft it, because then it helps you build that memory of knowing how much is in there just by hefting. But you have to sort of get used to that.
You do have to get used to it, and it's not an easy skill. As I say, I take the roofs off to do my heft. I will literally just pop the roof off, feel the weight of the colony, put the roof back on. It takes seconds. And if I feel that one of them is a little bit light, well, I'll feel another one, and what does that feel like? I might go back to the light one and just have another go, and just to make sure. I'd rather do that. I'd rather double check, and I'm more likely to put fondant on than not if I feel that a colony is getting a bit light. And equally, the bees, they won't, if they don't need that fondant, they won't take it. But the price of a packet of fondant is way cheaper than a replacement colony if they starve over the winter.
Absolutely, especially if your association buys it in bulk, so you're not paying enormous prices for it.
Yes, that's right.
There's one last comment. Please don't cover the whole bottom board with Vaseline, just a quarter or a half. If you're asked to send a bottom board sample to the MBU or bee inspector, the Vaseline can't be washed off the detritus.
That's a very reasonable comment, actually. I suspect it probably could if you give it a swish with isopropyl alcohol, but that's not something that the majority of people have sort of floating about in their houses, is it? So I think that's a reasonable piece of advice. Yes.
Yeah. Right. And with that, I will say thank you very much, Lesley. There are lots and lots of thank yous in the chats.
My pleasure.
So thank you again for your talk. It was really excellent. I hope everyone's enjoyed that. Go enjoy the rest of your Wednesday. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.